everyone. Welcome to ACMI and thank you for sharing your Sunday afternoon with us. My name is Amita Kirpalani and I'm one of the ACMI curators, and I'm very happy to be sharing the stage with Dr. Christian Thompson AO, who is the inaugural recipient of the Mordant Family VR Commission, one of ACMI's really innovative programs where we facilitate, along with City of Melbourne, a contemporary artist to have the opportunity to work in VR for the first time. And I've had the pleasure of working with Christian on this project, Bayi Gardiya, which, how many people have seen this work yet? Oh, wow, oh, very good. Well, I hope this discussion about it will encourage you to go right upstairs straight afterwards and see the work. Is it 7 minutes long? But it's seven...
Total experience.
Yeah, 7 very beautiful minutes. So the exhibition is on until the 23rd of May, and it's just upstairs, and it's free. Before Christian and I talk about Bayi Gardiya and draw a line from past work of Christian's to this most recent work, I want to make an acknowledgement of country, which at ACMI isn't an unthinking recitation, but rather, since we're in a museum, talking, thinking and spending time with art is so much about context and feeling welcome. So we wish to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today, as well as their elders past, present and emerging. And you're part of this conversation as well, so I encourage you to stir up some questions and we'll call for them at the end of the, towards the end of the conversation in an hour. So with Christian's permission, I'm not going to do a formal reading of your biography. It's long, but not because it's long. But I hope that we can touch on key projects as we continue in our talk. So in thinking about kind of where you're from and where you've been, I want to talk about those letters. I want to talk about doctor, and I want to talk about AO first and what they mean right now, what it meant to, because in January you received the Order of Australia for your, can I read what it was for before we begin? For outstanding service to the visual arts as a sculptor, photographer, video and performance artist, and as a role model for young Indigenous artists. And I wonder how that feels now, or what that means to you right now.
Hi everyone. Happy Mother's Day.
Oh yeah, hi mums.
I think it's kind of a galvanizing moment, really. I think it kind of makes you take stock of where you've been and where you've arrived at, and kind of re-energizes you to move forward.
And we're going to talk about Oxford in a second, but I wondered if you wanted to mention, we'll also be talking quite a lot about what home is to you, where home is exactly, and I wondered, perhaps we should start there. Where is home for you? You're based in Melbourne, between Melbourne and Oxford, but where is home?
Well, I grew up all over the country, but my father's family are from central Western Queensland, Barcaldine, which is about 13 hours inland from Brisbane. And we spent all of our childhood there, Christmas, Easter, school holidays. So wherever we were, we would always trek back to out home, we would say, which is Barcaldine. But these days, I kind of still spend a lot of time there, but also Melbourne's my other home. Fitzroy Pool.
Yeah. But that's, yeah, Barcaldine is crucial. And Barcaldine sits in a particular language group, which we'll talk more about, but do you want to mention that briefly?
The greater language group?
Yeah.
Well, it's part of the Central Desert language group, so the Palmer-Nyungan language group, which is Central Australia, but expands out into Western Australia, Queensland, South Australia, and the Northern Territory. So it's quite a large area.
But the language of the Thompsons is Bidjara.
Bidjara. So traditionally we're actually from Springshaw, Carnarvon Gorge, Charleville area, which is very close. But my great-great-great-grandfather, Charlie Thompson, actually moved all of our family from Missions and brokered our family's freedom essentially, and moved the whole family there by horse and buggy. And he actually bought a block of land around the early 1900s by usurping the authorities by telling them that he was an Afghan. And by the time that they had realized that he actually was Aboriginal, they'd already signed over the deeds. So there was a kind of political activism even before there was a word for it. And I'm very proud of that, coming from that heritage.
And his name was Charlie.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've got a few images to show and a little bit of work just to kind of use as a spine for our conversation today. So as a way to kind of step from Barcaldine to Oxford, I wanted to talk about the series.
Quite a departure.
It's a bit of a trip.
Yeah, just a little.
A little bit of a journey. To talk about the series We Bury Our Own. And this is Down Underworld, from a series of images that you made in 2012. And of course, in the back of my mind, thinking about these images, they're so deeply connected with Bayi Gardiya. But we'll get there. So do you want to talk about how this series of images came about?
Well, when I was, prior to arriving at Oxford, I was doing my Masters of Theatre at the Amsterdam School of Arts at a place called Das Arts, which was a very challenging program. And towards the end of it, I was like, I never want to do postgraduate study ever again. I've just had it. And then the Perkins Trust Foundation announced the scholarships to Oxford. And my friend was like, well, you know, you should at least apply, and then you can make up your mind if you actually are successful. So I ran around like a lunatic for a week because I had to get references from all around from people in Australia and around the world. I think you have to have 6 references, 3 national and 2 international. And then got the application in, and then I was shortlisted, and then had a phone interview, and then flew back to Australia and had an in-person interview with the Dean of University of New South Wales, the University of Sydney, and then was successful, but I didn't know that it was a historical thing. I didn't know that no Aboriginal person had ever been admitted to the University of Oxford, so that was
900 years.
900 years. So that was kind of a surprise. No pressure.
But you talk about, like, I want to talk about the pressure, because you've mentioned it in a conversation with Hetty Perkins in, I've got the catalogue here, for your, not to deviate too wildly, but their ritual intimacy show that Christian is currently on tour, but Christians, a survey of Christians' work, that was at Mama, and you talk about that first day in Oxford a little bit. You touch on the pressure. It was...
Yeah, I mean, because I grew up in the military, I was used to kind of going to new cities and having to go to, well, I wouldn't call them cities, regional centres, very regional. So I was used to that kind of feeling of walking into new environments and having to adapt very quickly to survive, really. And I think that first day, the matriculation, where you wear the full sub-fusk outfit,
which is what you're wearing in the
I'm wearing
image.
here,
Yeah.
and you have like a little corsage thing, and you, yeah. And it was very kind of a very out-of-body experience, and it was also kind of reflecting on my whole life until I'd arrived at that point. But it did feel like, you know, the first day of high school at one of these different high schools that I went to, just kind of going, just go. Yeah.
Yeah. But you talk with Hetty about just like, right, gonna get on with it.
Yeah.
Yep,
It was
gonna
really,
go for it.
yeah, I mean, I think I had my own purpose, and I had my own focus, and then I just kind of, everything else was just sort of going on around me. But it was very daunting at moments. It was like I didn't come from that cultural background. I didn't have that same sort of genesis. I didn't go to Eton and then like just sort of naturally go to Oxford. It was a very different kind of course to arrive there. But I knew that I wanted to work with the Pitt Rivers Museum collection because I'd heard about it, and a few people had said, you know, if you ever get the chance, you should work with this collection because I think it would be really beneficial for you, and I think you would get a lot out of it as well.
And what was it about? What was that motivation to work with that collection? What did you know about it that really drew you there?
All I knew that it was kind of like a museum of what museums used to be like, in terms of nothing in the museum is arranged by country and region, it's just arranged by object. So there's these kind of old-fashioned latrines. It's almost like a museum of natural curiosities, or a Wunderkammer or something like that. And so it will just have a lot of these kind of glass vitrines that are just full of like smoking instruments, or sort of, what else?
Well, a lot of I understand a lot of like ethnographic or categorized as ethnographic images of Indigenous people at a house there.
No, not so much imagery, mostly objects.
Right.
I knew that I wanted to work with the collection, and then when I arrived, it coincided with an ARC project that was looking at the repatriation of photographs from European collections in Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Britain. So that kind of defined the parameters of my research project, and I was invited to have create a body of work that resonated with some of the themes in the ARC project, but as a visual project, and so that's how We Bury Our Own came about.
Just go to the next image, Desert Melon. And can you talk about, you undertook a process that you've called spiritual repatriation, and I'd love you to talk about what that is and how you actually spent time with images to undertake this process.
Well, I think historically, the artist-museum collaboration has always been to take objects from the museum collection and to arrange them in a way that highlight some of the more repressed or oppressed histories. Fred Wilson is a classic example of that, or James Luna.
Do you want to talk about Fred Wilson? Because you really focused on his work for your thesis, or does that give you the...
Yeah, well, his work was really a benchmark for the museum artist collaboration. And I think at the time, they were very, very different spaces, and inviting an artist into a museum collection to respond to the history of those collections, and also to interact with the objects themselves, was a very kind of controversial thing to do. Now it's become more commonplace as museums have had to adapt to stay relevant. And I was invited to work with the Australian photographic collection, which is actually a very small collection. It's predominantly images from Tyndale, Spencer, you know, the usual suspects in terms of kind of early colonial photographs of Indigenous people. But for me, it was like, I really don't want to re-represent those images and then just iterate the historical trope with which they were created. And I also thought it was very disrespectful to show images of deceased people for cultural reasons, because we believe that you're unresting the soul of those people. So that really made me rethink my role as a kind of conduit between the aura of the photographic collection and then transporting that from ethnographic and anthropological into contemporary and into contemporary artwork as well.
There's so much in that. What you've just said, there's so much in that. And you've spoken about building these images, this series, as you're responding to the archive, like sculptures, without re-representing or representing those images of specifically featuring deceased people. And so how did you do that? What is the actual mechanism by which you did that?
Well, I guess I had to kind of reflect on my own artistic training and return back to a kind of more pure place in a way. And that was, rather than looking at these images as objects and as from a more traditional researcher point of view, I had to basically meditate on the imagery and just go into the museum and just spend time with the collection. And then that kind of went in and slowly digested. It became part of my kind of experience at Oxford. And then slowly that emerged in the work. So it was a very different kind of approach, but a very autoethnographic approach, which I learnt is a kind of a very prescient mode in my work.
And so the way that I understand autoethnography is that it's first person responding without the kind of, I guess, ethnographic frame. It's not scientific. It is kind of personal, biographical.
Reflective.
One person seeing another thing and talking to that. And you were doing that silently in a way. Is that right? That was you were spending time with images in a meditative, silent mode with them.
Well, there's no option really, because you're in a room where you have to be quiet. You have to kind of. It wasn't like I was kind of, standing there just staring really intently at an image. But
Thank you.
I was offered the images on a CD by Christopher Morton, who's the curator of manuscripts. And I said, no, I won't keep them on my person. Rather, I'll just come in and spend time with the imagery and with the images. And then the very early experiments were completely different to what finally emerged. And so it was a much more intuitive and reflective process that was about, I'm kind of like a bowerbird. I tend to just, I think it's sort of like osmosis or something. Things just kind of get banked away, and then eventually they kind of reconfigure and then emerge as finished work. So,
But I like thinking that you're working as with respect, a slow-moving bowerbird. Like this was a long process. You took your time, and I love the idea that you didn't want to possess. You didn't want to colonize these images for yourself, for your own work. Rather, it was a kind of transmission that was occurring between you and the image.
yeah, and if I'm part of that lineage of artists like Fred Wilson, James Lerner, and whoever else, it's how does my work differentiate and how does my work push that conversation forward? And so that was kind of, in my dissertation, I look at this sort of genesis of artist-museum collaboration, and then specifically focus on Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum, but then demonstrate how my work is similar, but how my work is also very different and moves the conversation into a different direction, which is about incorporating traditional customs and about the collection becoming a directorial force in the creation of new forms of cultural knowledge and capital.
And also it's about reverence and ceremony too.
Yeah.
And you've talked about that.
Yeah, I think it was about creating a different space in the museum that was, rather than the kind of traditional museum environment of kind of looking into these vitrines, it created a very different space which was almost reflecting the museum back at itself, but without having to participate in the kind of ethnographic and anthropological themes that often dominate and those objects.
Yep.
They're just rendered as ethnographic, not part of a kind of contemporary conversation.
And before we leave this series of work, I wonder if we can just look a little more deeply at this particular image. Like, do you want to talk to this tree and and what it is and what it means to you and where it's from.
Well, this is actually a tree that's just outside of Barcaldine. It's actually where one of my cousins is buried, or is planted in his honour. And we would drive into town, and my dad would tell us to wave out the window to our cousin. So there's this really beautiful synchronicity between us and the natural world, and the natural world is kind of metaphors for people and as a barometer for life experience, for pain, for happiness, sadness, all of the things that, you know, are part of the lived experience. And so when I arrived there, I was really reflecting on my my past and wanting to really bring that into the work that I was making. And you know, of course, it was great that we were the first Aboriginal people to ever be admitted, but we also had a lot to contribute to the culture of the university as well. So I wanted to bring that autoethnographic experience and that personalized, but also it was very kind of ritualistic as well, in the sense that all the things that I naturally gravitated towards in the museum collection were quite unusual. I was very interested in the English folklore material especially. There was like a little box that had mole's feet in it that had been severed off. And they looked like little hands, like little tiny hands, like inside this box. And it was said to have been a cure for toothache, that you sever the forefeet off a mole and set it free, and then put the little hands.
Toothache.
Thank God for Sensodyne, right? We've moved on since then. Just sever the forefeet off some moles, you'll be fine. You need a root canal. And then there was a slug that was impaled on a branch that was like a, what's it called, like ivy or something, you know, has like a spike on it, and that was for something else. And then there was a ox's heart that was pounded with rusted nails, and that was said to, if you buried that in somebody's yard, that was said to have brought ill will upon that person. Or there was a witch's ladder, which was found in an old woman's house somewhere in the Cotswolds, I think. And it was a ladder that had cock's feathers through it. And it was said that it was a way to crawl into people's subconscious while they were asleep.
Oh, that's amazing. That's
Thank
amazing.
So I really, and also they were just very unusual combinations of objects. They came from really different, but very organic. And so I like that votive, that kind of pre-Christian sort of the old kind of pagan way of seeing the world. And actually, you know, Britain does have a kind of tribal history prior to Christianity. So I was interested in those roots, and also in this sort of unlikely collision of different objects and how that can sort of create new meanings. So I found them very kind of provocative, in the sense that I was using my own autobiography to draw on different references, and that bring that into my sort of contemporary experience at being at Oxford. And that's why I'm wearing the sub-fusk. But then I'm using this tree that's almost like a kind of protest piece of propaganda, but inside the image it's a tree. So yeah, I think the synchronicity of the kind of human experience in the natural world has actually always been in my practice from the very beginning.
And it's also secret, like it's knowledge, like that the sort of import of that tree is perhaps only known to your family. Like this is sort of contained knowledge which is not universally accessible.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it's necessary that the audience, you know, knows that either. Yeah.
should we talk to Dead Tongue from 2017? I thought we should. Do you want to talk a little bit about what happens in this video? We're not going to show a clip, but just to kind of set the scene.
Well, I'm singing in the background, singing in Bidjara, and in the video it's just me with these two kind of parade-sized British flags that are kind of flying in the wind, and I'm just sort of staring into the distance. So you can hear the voice kind of emanating around, but I'm not actually articulating them with my mouth because it's being kept closed by the British flag.
And your eyes are kind of opening and closing.
Yeah.
Which in her essay about you, Warner talks about how this is like a reminder for us that you're very much alive and you're very much connecting the past, the present, and potentially the future, which I love that notion about this work. But I actually wanted to quote someone who you've talked to me a little bit about is Laurie Anderson, and I wanted to sort of raise this idea that she talks about I think she talks about it as like a power of that the performer can actually hide on stage, and I sort of wanted to draw that into our conversation, which is about you singing in Bidjara, you performing in song, but also the masquerade or the sort of like performance of yourself in different guises. And I wondered how that idea of hiding on stage, whether that resonates for you at all, or how you feel about that. Obviously, we're not allowed to do it now. So.
Well, it's weird because I don't see myself in my own work. For me, it's become that was written on very early on in the piece, I think, that there is a kind of performativity in my practice. But for me, it's about the representation of an idea at that time, and I'm just a vehicle to present that idea. So when I look back at the work, I go, oh, yeah, no, that's around the time that I was really, into this, or I was really obsessed with that, or there was around that life experience, or when I lived at this house, or... So it's a culmination of many different things, but it's not, contrary to popular belief, I don't like looking at myself.
Okay,
so I kind of disassociate from it.
Okay.
Which is weird in itself.
Do you hear yourself then? Do you want to hear yourself, or do you like hearing yourself? You don't like looking at yourself? Like if your body is simply a body to communicate with, what about listening to yourself? I like it.
I don't mind listening to myself.
Yeah. And I'm not.
Well, not in a like a.
You. Like
you're amazing, but I kind of like the.
You have to listen to yourself singing in this language. The way that you make music, as far as I understand, you have to listen to yourself.
Well, it's important because otherwise, how are you going to get to a new place, vocally or sonically or compositionally, if you don't revisit things and kind of go, maybe I could change that, or you actually start to build a vocabulary of certain vocal techniques or certain compositional things that are uniquely yours. So it's the same as with your practice. You have to kind of revisit material and you have to sort of listen to it over and over again in order to move to the next place. But I really enjoy working in the studio. I enjoy working in with sound because it's and with language because it's a much more quiet place and it's very, it's just me, my voice, and a studio. Whereas if I'm making a body of work, I have to be the photographer, the model, the costume designer, I have to sort of do it all, which is very stressful.
Yeah, it sounds much like you mentioned before, you in the museum with the image, like this sort of quiet that's possible, the meditation and the focus on like technique, I guess, is part of that. Technique and thinking, like that you kind of give yourself that space is really crucial.
It's the directness. I feel like I move very quickly, and I like to. I feel like the ideas come very quickly, and I need to constantly be producing.
This showing this still from this work was also a way to talk about Marina Abramovich. Mama Marina. So she saw a very early version of this work, and can you talk about your relationship with her, how you met her? Tell us the whole story, please.
Well, we were sort of orbiting each other for a very long time because she gave one of the sort of classes at Das Arts. So she already had a relationship. Obviously, she lived in Amsterdam for many years.
Did you took that class, or you knew that you took her?
No,
class?
this was prior to me being there. She had been one of the mentor people at Das Arts. So that was I'd already entered that community, and she was kind of omnipresent and very revered within that circle of people, the performance art world. And then I was meant to do a performance with Ule before he became unwell. That never eventuated. And then obviously Marina had a show at the Pitt Rivers Museum as well.
Right.
So we kind of were following a similar, well, I was following her. And then when I'd moved to London, and then I was, Caldor Arts Projects approached me, and Marina had already heard of my work and had put me down as one of the people that she wanted to be part of the mentorship at Caldor Arts Projects in Sydney. So I came back to Australia for that, which was kind of like a 2-week boot camp at Pier 2 in Sydney in the middle of winter, which was freezing.
But come on, Sydney winter's not. Sorry.
It was
Anyway,
over the
I won't quibble.
girl over the ocean with no cracks in the floor. Actually, coming from London, I should have been
Exactly.
totally.
A bit tougher.
It's like it's a beautiful day in here, and yeah. So I kind of knew that I wanted to. It was a very similar format to Das Arts, where you had to present your ideas to the public and perform. So I felt like I was already very well, prepared for that kind of environment, and I already knew that I wanted to make this work. But I was also struggling with the idea of music in my work, which is kind of a bit of a... People don't like to use that word.
I want to talk to because we had a little when we were writing the didactic for Bayi Gardiya together. We were thinking about how we're going to describe this work, and I wrote the word music, and you're just like. We do not use that word. We do not use that word. And I want to talk to you about why have I offended you, and how have I offended you, and what is wrong with that word? If it's song, is song okay?
You didn't offend me.
A little.
Okay.
You did the face
just a little, just a smidge.
So if music's not okay, song is okay.
Well, because I think that it fits, I see my work as fitting into a lineage of sound artists like Meredith Monk, Laurie Anderson, Christian Marclay, those people that's the kind of origin that I have in terms of my relationship to sound. Also because these works have a very practical motivation behind them, which is about the preservation, archiving and re-representation of our language, which is considered a lost language. So there's a kind of very practical purpose behind that. So to say music, I think, is kind of a bit, it sort of waters down the seriousness behind them as well. But that's they're the people who have been very inspirational for me, and that's the canon that I see myself coming from. So yes, they're melodic, but actually there is no music. It's all my own voice that's been digitally manipulated to create this kind of almost cinematic sort of immersive sound environment. It's not like I'm dropping a single or do you know what I mean? It's that's the kind of, I think that's where I see it being different. And also I think I don't want to be marginalized from that conversation because I'm an Indigenous person. It's no, I am a contemporary artist. I have, quite a comprehensive educational background, and that's where I see my work fitting. So I don't want it to be rendered to something.
And also maybe separated from imagery, like maybe when you talk about music, it separates it from imagery, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, they all take different forms. There's one sound work where I've created the sound of a bee swarm by using the words muna and nual, which are the Bidjara words for bee and bee swarm. And we've digitally used the algorithm of a bee swarm to sample my voice. So you actually feel like there is a swarm of bees around you, but it's actually my voice mastered in a way. So, and then Refuge is kind of more of a pop sort of, I mean, that is more of that's more of a music work. But for Bayi Gardiya, I think it's an immersive sound environment, and it's one aspect of the work that's synchronized with the virtual world that is evolving around you.
Well, I wonder if now's a good point to maybe have a look at Versus. We might just have a little look at some music, look and listen to. So that was a very short clip from the work Versus from 2017. Am I saying that correctly?
Versus.
I wasn't.
Yes,
I'll just mumble it next time. And actually, let's rest on this this image while we talk about it. But I want to refer to the clip that we just saw, and to sort of tie this back to performing song. Like I want to have a conversation with you about that as we sort of think about this work in VR. This performing to camera, performing song, and what that means to you.
Well, I think the previous work that I'd made was Dead Tongue before I made Versus. And that was part of my survey show, Ritual Intimacy, was a new commissioned work by Muma. Excuse me. And that was the first time I'd worked with a pretty big team, like a director, a grip, a editor, the sound, makeup artist, the whole sort of everything. And I wanted to make a work that was like a choir of, but with multiple screens, where my voice kind of synchronized and became sort of very, like a choir, by sort of layering the vocals and the video moving. Sorry, what was that?
Well, I'm just interested in how, for me, that work that we just saw the clip from is a real investigation of. It's a very. I'm going to quote you and say, like, it's a very simple aesthetic gesture, and you're communicating a whole lot through song.
Well, the process of just singing in our language, which is considered a lost language itself, is a kind of statement in terms of referring to it as a lost language. It can't be referred to as a lost language if it's being presented as a living language in the context of the art world. So that's where the art world can actually play quite a important role in empowering and also providing the sort of platform to archive language, but also as not as a side note, but as part of the greater Australian conversation, because often Indigenous voices are neither referenced, validated, included in the public conversation. And so for me, that's where there's another kind of impetus behind those works. But the aesthetic gesture is just performing the language, bringing the language to life. not in a pedagogic kind of way, but in a way that's experiential, that's contemporary. And melody is a great sound, is a great vehicle to keep language alive. And when I was in the Sydney Biennale that David Elliott curated, which was, God, I can never, this title's like this long, but it's Songs of Survival, The Beauty of Distance, Songs of Survival in a Precarious Age.
Too long.
And the work that I had in it was called Gamu Mambu, and it's where I have a Dutch Baroque opera singer singing in Bidjara. And in these early works I was actually translating them, but then later lost the translations. But it was on Cockatoo Island, and I was very nervous about being in that show. It's a big show. And we were walking around, and I heard a lady walk past me, and she was like, "Na, na, 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 na," and it was the melody of the song. So it would obviously, you know, it's very infectious, and it sort of goes right into your, you know, it goes right in, you know, people internalize it, yeah. And so for me, that was a huge sign that it was a very successful work.
It's about at this point that I should start taking questions from you, but I have about 28 more to go. No, I won't hold you here for that long, but I just wanted to kind of skip forward, if I may, but please put your hand up and Zoe can come around with a mic, and we'd love to take your questions. But let's get to Bayi Gardiya. I wonder if Alex, if you could play, there's some, just before you hit play, we want to show some aerial footage that you took when you went to Barcaldine as the kind of building blocks for this VR experience. So we're just going to show that with some of the song that you've made. So that's a very quick sense of what you're talking about when you're talking about Barcaldine. That's correct? And that footage, do you want to talk to that footage a little bit before we dig into the work?
Yeah, I mean that was kind of the first step in, well, actually it wasn't the first step, but it was probably sort of towards the middle of the project. We had to go there and get the templates to base the virtual animation on. So we had to get drones and walk sort of down the creek bed and sort of photograph it in segments like this.
And at the time you're filming, was this project, you could see it? Or you could see a version of it? Or like, how did it feel at that time?
Well, that's the weird thing, is it's very immaterial for a long time. So you have an image of what the work is going to look like, but delivery seems, you know, so far away. So the idea of the two matching up is quite a, I mean, I think there were like 15 people working on this project in total, probably more.
And you're working with Nakatomi?
Working with Electric Dreams, who did the sound component, and then working with Nakatomi in Sydney. But to just go back a bit, I had never really thought of working in VR before. And then I actually caught up with Marina Abramovich in London, and we were hanging out, and she was just doing that work, a big VR project in New York. And she sort of said to me, "Oh, you know, do you work in VR?" And I was like,
"You're not going to
"No."
do her voice?
She was like, do you work in the VR? And I was like, no, I don't really work in the VR. She was like, you should work in the VR. And I was like, I don't really work in the VR. She goes, work in the VR. And I went, okay, I will work in VR. I was like, fine, though, we'll work in the VR. And so when this project, came up, I sort of thought, oh, actually, that's like the perfect next step away from Berserse, which was a pretty big project. But I was thinking, where am I going to go from here in terms of expanding or incorporating sound and the visual component? I thought, oh, virtual reality would be the best of it, you know, the most amazing opportunity to bring sound, space, experience, immersion, like everything together in one work. And then the first sort of part of it was the sound component. And for this project, sometimes it just really happens very immediately. And then other times it's just like a real slog. And this was a real slog. It just wasn't coming to me at that time. It was just kind of, I mean, for me, it's like the ideas kind of percolate beneath the surface. And when they're ready to be presented, it will just literally come to me as a fully formed idea. But this was like not happening like that.
And so what was the start then? What did you grab onto in the very beginning of making that song?
It was a very slow process. It was just kind of slowly, I mean, it wasn't that lyrically it was kind of there, but it just wasn't kind of, well, firstly I have to write the song, the sound, then I have to learn the language, then I have to perform it, and just getting it to kind of, you know, rhythmically and melodically sort of work just was a very slow process. But then eventually it did happen, but that was, for a long time, it was just working in the studio with Mark at Electric Dreams, and that was the first component, and that was kind of a bit of a slog. And then in the middle of the project, we had to go to Barcaldine to get all of the templates, and then we were still working on the sound component.
Templates being images of the
environment.
Mile.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about what the 6 Mile is and what it means to you?
Well, it's basically a creek where we've swum pretty much our entire lives. I have photos of me, a very fat baby, just being dunked in the water there. And it's just a very, very nostalgic and sentimental site for me that's full of lots of happy memories, but it almost has a kind of spiritual resonance to it, the water, and also the area has been in drought for over a decade, and the 6 Mile has not run, although recently there was water in there and we got to go swimming, which was amazing that it was like during this project that it flowed for the first time in over a decade. So I was casting a little spell.
Well, I mean, I want to pick
My
up...
assistant's like, you're a witch. And it's also been a kind of barometer for the effects of climate change and human activity on that environment, which is a very complex and very vulnerable semi-desert hinterland. And so it became a kind of a metaphor for my own life experience, but then also as a barometer of the effects of human activity on landscape.
I wanted to quote Hetty Perkins again in relation to Bayi Gardiya, because with her, you talk about...
Oh, you mean Berserse?
No, about the VR project. She didn't talk to you about that, but I'm just thinking about your conversation and how it's sort of... This comment, you were talking about the performance of country being tied to seasonal change. And you were talking about another project, but I like that this has kind of come back in this VR project, that here this VR project is alive with language, song, performance of song, seasonal change, and a sort of spiritual connection. I mean, you feel that in that work, I think.
Yeah, I mean, seasonal change over, like almost feels like over like a thousands of years, as well as being in one kind of yearly cycle as well. I think you get that.
Yeah.
Line.
Yeah.
But I think there's also something kind of melancholy. There's a kind of a sadness in the work as well, because I feel like you're experiencing the kind of rhythms and the energy and the dynamism of the natural world, but in this virtual world, yet at the same time, we can't seem to see that our own real environment is struggling a lot right now. So for me, that felt like a kind of, there's a sort of sadness in that as well. And also the way, I wanted to synchronize language and land together, because this is the language that comes from that landscape that's been spoken in that land for 120,000 plus years that we know of. So bringing them together was very, very critical part of the work.
While we
They
wait,
kind of, they sort of reflect off each other, and the landscape moves around you in unison with the language.
I like that perhaps we can't tell, and we shouldn't be able to tell who's moving whom. Is the song moving the landscape, or is the landscape moving the song? And I really enjoy that about the work. We still have time for questions, but I'm just going to keep hogging the mic until anyone puts their hand up, because I just have 2 more images. Oh, we've got one. Is Zoe? Sorry. She's coming. I promise she's coming. She's coming. Zoe, I'm just up the front.
Go.
Thanks very much. Okay, you've spoken about how you don't want to be marginalised as an Indigenous artist, and from one of your previous interviews I've heard you say something fairly similar to that, and obviously I want to respect that. At the same time, I'd like to ask you about different influences. You've mentioned being mentored by Marina Abramovich. I'd like to ask you, and this is not in any derivative way, but has any art that could be described as queer contributed to your work in any way?
Yeah.
And would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I love Zoe Leonard's work, Lee Bowery. Robert Mapplethorpe. Who else? Yeah, I mean, the list just goes on and on. But I definitely, that definitely resonates with me.
If I can build on that question, perhaps, is like, how do you see it in your own work? How do you see your queer identity in your own work? Or do you? It's complicated because you said before you don't like to look at yourself in your own work, or you're not interested in looking at yourself. So can you hear your queer identity in your work, perhaps, is a better question.
Well, I have, I think I've always been attracted to the subversive and the, not the mainstream. So I think sometimes I've been attracted to things that are sort of just beneath the surface of popular culture, and then I've filtered them through my own lived experience, and then they come together in my work. So there's kind of 3 different things at play. There's my lived experience, there's kind of the subconscious realm where those ideas get sort of remixed and reconfigured, and then there's my practice, which is like an expression of both of those things combined together.
And you're making the ladder with the feathers on it. I'll never forget that image now of the witch's ladder, a ladder to the subconscious as a ladder with feathers on it.
Yeah.
It's firmly imprinted now forever. I just want to click to, yeah, I will, this isn't your how to vote card, but I just can't help but put this up in this moment, because you took this photo, and I want you to talk about this expression and how you got there and what this was like, and I just want you to kind of talk to it for a moment.
Well, the Monthly had approached me a couple of times about shooting one of their covers. I think they were kind of doing it in a sort of interview magazine. sort of style way. And I've sort of been very reticent about doing it. And then they asked me if I would shoot Bill. And I was like, okay. And I'm actually, Barcaldine is actually where the Labor Party was founded. So I felt like there was a kind of strong synergy there with my own background and the sort of origins of the Labor Party. And also I'd never really done anything like that before, like a sort of commercial, well not commercial, but more of a kind of commercial photography sort of job where I was shooting somebody else. And it was a very kind of organic experience. We just met, Bill came to the studio, and we just tried out a few of the color backdrops against his skin tone to make it pop. And I just chatted to him as I was just running off shots. And it's interesting because a lot of people have seen this image and then didn't realize that I'd taken it, and then saw that I did, and then contacted me and said I actually was firstly immediately drawn to the image, and then I saw that you'd taken it, and they sort of called me and said that they thought that it sort of represented a side of him that very few people see, and that it represented something of his kind of internal life, which was a huge compliment. But it was also a really great experience. He was a lovely guy, and I really enjoyed not being in front of the camera for once.
Because I love
just kind of having fun with it. And I sort of realized, even though I don't have a formal photography training, I mean, I did a bit in undergrad, but over the years, I have cultivated my own kind of technique, and also my own knowledge of photography, which was kind of enlightening for me as well.
The article's titled "Between Fear and Ideas," and I love like that. That is a portrait of that. I love that. And just a last image. What's this?
This is a portrait that's in the Archibald Prize, and my friend Thea painted it.
Thea Perkins.
Thea Perkins, and she's an old family friend. In fact, our families actually go back almost 100 years, or just over 100 years. My great uncle and aunt were Charlie Perkins' father's maid of honor and best man at his wedding in Barcaldine.
Amazing.
So Thea, who's his great granddaughter, and Maddie, we were sort of joking about how they probably went to the rodeo together, and we hang out in the David Jones cosmetic department together. But it's weird that that was always there, and that we sort of became friends, or we've sort of I've known them since they were little kids, really. And in the painting, I'm holding a desert slipper, and this is a traditional cactus from our area, and we plant it on our family's graves, and as the plant grows back, it is symbolic of the return of the spirit back to the earth, but also a sort of presence in the real world at the same time. And the little flowers look like little pink high heels, which are very cute. So again, that synergy between the natural world and sort of our family customs. It was interesting. A lot of people have said, wow, she really knows you. She's captured something of you that you don't see in your own work. And I was like, yeah, I think I'm very sort of controlling over the production qualities and the composition. It's very different to a representation of myself, and I think you see that in this painting. Yeah.
Well, we have run out of time, I'm afraid, but I hope that you feel very motivated to go upstairs and have a look at Christian's work, Bayi Gardiya. It's on until, as I mentioned, the 23rd of May. It is 7 minutes of beautiful, immersive sound and vision. And thank you so much, Christian, for talking today.
Thank you.